Hi, I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, we're returning white-owned land to black Africans. Help South Africa.
We'll discuss the country's plan for land expropriation without compensation. The African National Congress says it wants to take back land without compensation from white farmers and transfer ownership to black citizens. The plan aims to reduce racial disparities in land ownership caused by the nation's history of land dispossession, where colonizers forced black South Africans to live in rural reserves.
White South Africans still own the majority of land in a country that is 80% black. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, the government has been slowly buying back white-owned land for redistribution to black farmers. But government critics say the process has taken too long and has brought little change. So how should South Africa right the wrongs of the past as far as land is concerned? With us to talk about this in Potchefstroom, Elmine du Plessis. She is an associate professor of law at Northwest University, where she teaches land reform, indigenous law and property law. In Cape Town, Sihle Ingobezi is a sociologist. And also in Cape Town, we have Ben Cousins, Research Chair of Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Hello, everybody. Good to have you.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. We got several questions online from our community when we said we were doing this show about what expropriation is. Here's just one. Here's another from OS wanting to know the present generation of farmers and how they got this land. We actually got an answer on Twitter. This is Thabo, who says, land expropriation without compensation has to happen. When the Dutch settlers arrived, they never purchased the land, but expropriated it from the natives and forcefully removed them from the land. Obviously, this current generation, Thabo says, inherited the land from their forefathers that stole it. Apartheid legacy is still alive even after the fall of the apartheid system. Ben, he says expropriation has to happen after he gave us a brief history lesson there. Where do you fall on that argument?
Look, about 67% of all agricultural land is owned by white farmers. In the past, it's been even higher percentages. This is the result of a history of land dispossession, if you like, land theft, which helped to create an incredibly unequal and oppressive system. Not only apartheid, but the colonial era before that. It's undoubtedly a chief cause of poverty and inequality in our society today, and we have to do something about it. And there's no doubt that we need a wide-ranging land reform program. The slowness of land reform program means that suddenly expropriation of land, with or without compensation, is the big issue of the moment. But that history lives with us. It's a very real history. It's very apparent to many South Africans, and we have to do something about it.
Sihle, I want to share this HuffPost South Africa headline with you. Booing, heckling, screaming and chaos. Welcome to the land expropriation debate. Was that an over-the-top headline? Do people have their facts to hand?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, that probably refers to the debate that happened in Parliament where they discussed this very issue. There was a motion before the House which was essentially calling for land expropriation without compensation to be investigated as a means of speeding up land reform. So those descriptors are probably very accurate as to how that debate in the House happened. But the question really becomes this: how is the debate happening in society? How is this debate happening in the spaces where people don't have access to the media, don't have access to social media even to be able to voice their opinions? And there's a lot of research and data that shows that actually this isn't maybe the most front of mouth topic that most South Africans are talking about, and that actually unemployment and poverty are big issues. But again, I do agree with Ben Cousins, the good prof, when he says that land dispossession historically has played a major impact, or has had a major impact, of course, on how income distribution happens in this country.
Sihle, you make a really important point. How are everyday South Africans discussing this? You say they aren't, but when they are being asked about what they want about land reform, do they have the facts to hand?
Absolutely. I think we all, as South Africans, have a general grasp of the history of dispossession in this country. The issue really, and the real debate becomes, how do you fix this? Do you take a radical approach which is very symptomatic of this country's left, or as I call them, trendy lefties, really, who believe that the state should have the power to dispossess people without compensation, because that's what really it means, expropriation without compensation. It's essentially handing power over to the state to confiscate property from individuals and families in society without compensation? Or really, do we find another approach which is more rational, which allows for a more win-win outcome in society? And I put it to the guests and everybody here that most South Africans are looking for a win-win solution, one which is rational and legal and also secures property rights for all citizens, black or white.
When we talk about land expropriation in South Africa, another country, one of your neighbours, comes up, often in conversation. Courts here brings it up. Expropriating land without compensation is impossible. Take it from Zimbabwe. This idea that what happened in Zimbabwe, so let's go back to the year 2000, there was agrarian reform. So many of Zimbabwe's farmers were forced out, and then the farming economy, basically, the money out of the farming economy completely left Zimbabwe, and now they are really struggling and actually are inviting some of those farmers back to Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe, that idea that South Africa could end up like that. Ben, go ahead.
I don't think that's actually an accurate depiction of the situation.
Yeah.
The radical land reform in Zimbabwe did have some negative consequences, namely the suspension of the rule of law while land occupations were taking place, and the flight of capital. But in many respects, the agricultural economy has not collapsed at all. In fact, many of the beneficiaries of land reform are producing quite well. In particular, cash crops such as cotton in years gone by, and now tobacco. Smallholder farmers are very productive. The lack of supply of inputs as a result of the wider problems in the economy is a problem. But I think one also is exaggerating the extent to which white farmers are being allowed back. I don't think that's happening on any kind of scale at all. I think it's really less than 10. And I think the real lesson from Zimbabwe is that you can do a radical land reform, redistribute land to smallholder farmers. If you supply them with enough support, they can be very productive. And that's a very positive lesson we can take from Zimbabwe. The negative lesson is that we should do it within the rule of law. We shouldn't have human rights abuses, and we have to have it overseen by an effective state, which is not captured by corrupt interests or elite interests. That's my view on the Zimbabwe situation. I did live there for 8 years and worked for the Department of Agriculture and did my PhD there, in fact.
All right, well, I bow to your superior knowledge and perhaps a little bias there, Ben, perhaps.
Well, then I am also glad that this person on Twitter seems to agree with you, because you seem to be an expert on this. Andre says, at this stage, no one in the ruling party is proposing anything like Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform. Political and social conditions in the two countries are entirely different. Elmine, is that how you see it as well?
Yes, no, totally. I think, as Ben said, we still have the rule of law, and it's quite a firm rule of law where we have recourse to the courts if it's necessary. Perhaps we are leaning too much to the courts, some people argue. But I think what is happening in South Africa is actually quite a positive moment. I know it's very delicate. I know a lot of people are scared, but we are revisiting our 1994 pact that we made as a country. I think that same Andries du Toit made the point earlier this year that when he said maybe the issue is not really just about land or even about land at all. It is about nationhood. It's about social cohesion. I can't remember his exact words, but we are looking as a country on how we did or did not address the injustices of the past and what went wrong and how do we renegotiate it. Bekker also put it very nicely on Friday night. He said, we are the next generation. We cannot, look back at Mandela and say they made all these mistakes, because they did what they need to do, and we as the next generation, we need to think, how are we going to go forward? And I think that's a very positive point to be at the moment. And then to frame the land conversation in that sort of conversation is quite interesting, because that's basically a symptom of all the other things that is going on in the country, in my opinion.
I mean, you mentioned Bekker, and he's joining us right now from Johannesburg.
Right.
Bekker Kotobi is a South African lawyer who has been advising the government on land reform, and he's also the author of The Land Is Ours, South Africa's first black lawyers and the birth of constitution. Bekker, when you're looking at the risks associated with land reform or wholesale land reform, what concerns you the most about getting the job done?
Well, I think there are primarily three areas of concern from where I stand. The first area of concern is a lack of a clear plan by the government. I think for the past 24 years, we have not had a coherent, clear vision about what the government actually intends to doing in order to realize land reform. The second area of concern is short-termism. It is the idea that despite the fact that we've got clear policies and clear laws and clear legislation, when the government fails to implement those laws and legislation, it usually resorts to short-termism. In other words, you hear discussions about there is a need to change the constitution. So I do get worried about adherence to the rule of law. And then the third area of concern is the sheer slow pace of land reform. I think
That's right.
demand is quite clear across the board that the pace is too slow and got to be moving faster. And the slower we are, the greater the potential for social instability.
So
I think I would say, come in
ahead.
there and say that I think that's a similarity between South Africa and Zimbabwe. In fact, conditions, as Andries du Toit says, are in some ways very different, but the strong political symbolism of land is a similarity between the two. And if we don't deal with the land issue in South Africa, it's not going to go away. It stands for a whole lot of things, but it is also a very real issue in its own right. In urban areas, land occupations are taking place because people lack places to build houses for themselves. Of course, that's partly a housing issue and a services issue, not just a land issue, but it's being expressed as a land issue, and it's a very serious issue. And unless we deal with it rationally, populism, which was definitely present in Zimbabwe, could again severely distort our political system. There are real dangers as well as the opportunities that Elmin points out.
Yeah, look, I do agree with Prof and the good advocate there. You know, one has to remember that land restitution as an issue has a moral imperative to it. You know, we come from a country where, and really when I talk of it being a moral imperative, you know, it speaks to it being an issue of justice. If we are to move forward as a country, if we are to get this issue right, then we've got to actually put in place a rational legal framework which allows for the state to rectify its past wrongs. Because ultimately, the dispossession of mostly black people in this country happened at the hands of a coercive, manipulative state. Whether it was a colonial state or a apartheid state, you know, we have to fix that issue. And unfortunately, you have a situation where, and this is me agreeing with Advocate Ngugai Toby, sorry, my lights have gone off, is that, you know, the state has a very big role to play here in terms of giving people access to justice. And justice can take one of two forms. Either a return of land which was stolen and has been proven through a rational process to have been stolen to its rightful owners, or actually compensation for it. Because there's another component that we also need to speak about. Not everybody wants to go back to an agrarian form of life. And again, when we speak about this issue, it's not just about rural land, don't get me wrong. There's also urban dispossession that happened. But just a simple point, you know, we have to get the process, or rather, simply put, compensation is not the stumbling block to land reform in this country. So we also have to move the debate away from this almost weird obsession with compensation and actually focus on eliminating the corruption and the weak institutions.
I mean, go ahead.
Yes,
Yeah,
sorry, I would also like to come in here because I think we also focus a lot on government and what government needs to do, while I think we should also look at us as a society. I mean, we've got big agricultural unions like Agri-SA, they've got plans, they say, you know, in certain circumstances, private type of land reform worked. We need to assess that. We need to assess if things like that is also possible, because there are many ways of acquiring land and of transferring land, that I think we need to move away from this conversation of purely it being an issue about expropriation with or without compensation, because I think in this whole conversation, which has been a great conversation, we have pinpointed the problems with land reform, and it is fairly evident that it is not with the expropriation, well, mostly because the state has not used its expropriation powers. Yes, then Bekker?
I agree with you that we've got a problem of the state that has not tested the transformative potential of the Constitution. But I think we also have another problem of private landowners that essentially hike up the prices of land when they know that the state is a likely customer. So it seems to me that part of the solution, in fact, a central part of the solution, is actually a reduction in the prices of land. And that sometimes means that some portions of land should be acquired by the state with no compensation. So the real question, it seems to me, that if you want to address this on a sustainable basis, a market-related land redistribution program simply does not work. We have had 24 years of trial and error. When I asked the Minister of Land Affairs about a month ago how much money the state had paid for land reform, the amount is staggering. It's something like 54 billion rands. And if we have paid 54 billion rands and we've achieved less than 10%, I don't know what the figures are, Ben can help us with the figures, but we've achieved less than 10% of land redistribution, it's clear that a market-related solution does not work.
So I agree with you.
So I want to
that
jump in here because I hear
system.
the discussion that you guys are having, and I think, of course, it is very important to hear what South Africans think about this on this issue. But I wanted to bring in what others outside of South Africa are seeing on this issue, and it's headlines like this: South African group under fire for lobbying U.S. for white rights. A group representing many white Afrikaners has gone to the U.S. to lobby for the interests of white farmers. And I bring that up only because lots of people online are talking about this issue, the issue of murders of white farmers. Andrew says, as for these farm murders that have been in the headlines, I think the issue has been captured by our alt-right. Sure, there's a problem with violent crime, but it affects everyone, black and white, and attempts to frame it as part of a white genocide are divisive and dangerous. Another person tweeted in, this is H.D. Flores, and he actually pitched the topic of today's show, wanting us to sort facts from fiction. He says, what impact do campaigns like this PR campaign have on South Africa's global standing? If countries believe South Africa is creating a culture that is resulting in racially biased farm murders, can it lead to sanctions? Ben, do you want to take that on?
Yes.
You're
I
brave
wrote
enough,
an article in Newsweek recently suggesting that whites should stop panicking about land and suggesting that farm murders were not happening on a large scale. And I started to get hate mail from the alt-right in the US. I don't think it's very helpful. And I think there are many white South Africans who are saying, what can we do to make this work? How can we be part of the solution, not part of the problem? In fact, there are people offering to donate land. And I think we have the possibility now, under President Ramaphosa, of a national conversation about land, a new countrywide, nationwide conversation which sets us on a new path. That is the real opportunity.
But I also think
Sorry, Almin.
To chip in, Ben, I think we should also bring in that there's a dispute about, I must always put this disclaimer there that farm murders are happening. And every life lost is problematic, but we need to see this in context. And that issue of farm murders has been framed and been linked to the expropriation debate. So first it was framed that there's a upcoming, I think the word that we must use now is ethnic cleansing of white people. The stats are not clear, so that's the biggest problem in this debate. We do know that there is a problem with rural safety. People are vulnerable. But the problem is that this has been linked to the expropriation debate to say that there's a decisive drive to drive white people off the land. And I don't think there's evidence of that. And I think that's what Ben also tried to do, and I also tried to do the past 4 weeks. And it's a very difficult position to be in because it's a very emotive issue. People are getting killed. When you have this conversation, it sometimes sounds as if you are not respecting the issue of farm murders. So, but I think it's very important.
Should we not call it?
Yes.
Should we not call it for what it is? I mean, it is mischievous to claim that there is a genocide against white people in South Africa. It's complete mischief. And those people who went to America and created that impression, they were causing mischief and nothing else.
Bekker.
The statistics given by Agri-SA show that we are at a 20-year low in relation to farm murders. In 1997, there were more than 150 farm murders. Last year, 2017, there were 43. And that's still a high number, and it's an unacceptable number, but it's not a number that illustrates genocide by any stretch of the imagination.
Bekker,
Yes.
you mentioned Agri-SA, and we talked to them and asked them if they would be part of this conversation. They sent us statements about land reform in SA, and they said that the slow pace of land reform can be attributed to other things such as inadequate budget, poor implementation and corruption, but they are interested in how can they work and help land reform. It's a really important topic right now, and such a hot topic in Parliament. This is Julius Malema. This was back in earlier on in May, when you can hear his frustration. Have a listen.
There's nothing you can do. There's nothing this Parliament can do. With or without you, people are going to occupy land. We require no permission from you, from the president, from no one. We don't care. We can do whatever you want to do. Who are you to tell us whether we can occupy land or not? We are going to occupy land. Yes. South African occupy land. That's who we are.
Honourable
Member,
you
want to do.
Speaker,
You can withdraw my membership from this useless Parliament.
Honourable.
Bekker, useless Parliament. It is your job to advise the government right now. I am not clear, even after 30 minutes, what their plan is about a more equitable distribution of land for all South Africans, and especially black South Africans. Are you clear?
Yeah. Well, this was my entry point to the discussion, that what we've been experiencing in the past 24 years is a lack of a clear and a coherent plan around land reform. The messages that have been coming most recently are moving us towards a clearer path around land reform. At the very least, what we have at the moment is that there is an acknowledgement of the necessity to move along with urgency. And I think the second aspect, quite apart from the urgency aspect, the second aspect is to recognize the limits of restitution. And restitution essentially means historical claims to the land. Is to recognize the limits of that process and to move towards a dispensation that is based on land hunger. So I think if we address that, and then of course the final part being a commitment to the rule of law, I think that is absolutely crucial. And issues of compensation, I mean, Elmin is quite right. Issues of compensation in the order of things are quite low in relation to significance. So if it seems to me that we have clarity on two aspects, the one being a move towards a redistribution model that's based on need and a redistribution model that's underpinned by the rule of law, that is enough policy clarity, but that needs to be articulated quite strongly at the center.
We're right at the end of this show. The time goes so fast. Schley, I'm just wondering if you could describe what it is like for some black South Africans who have this need for land. How would you describe their lives?
Well, it's absolutely devastating, especially for those who can actually pinpoint exactly where historically their families used to live, or pieces of land that they used to own, but were dispossessed by either the colonial or the apartheid government. And again, when I talk about dispossession, it's not just rural land. It's also people who were forcibly removed from settled communities in urban parts of the country, communities which in some cases were more diverse than obviously what the apartheid government wanted. I mean, you think of Sophiatown as a good example. There is a real pain that permeates in a lot of South Africans today when we speak about issues of dispossession. Sure. And that dispossession is understood as being the exercise of coercive, manipulative state power over them. And
thank
the sense
you
of
so much
helplessness
for being part of this program. And Elmin and Ben and Bekker as well, we really appreciate your insights and your time today. Malika?
I'll end with this tweet from Ruth, who says, the problem is not that the state doesn't have enough power to expropriate land. The problem is that citizens don't have enough power to hold the state to account.
Thank you for being with us today. Malika and I will see you online. We're always there at AJ Stream. See you next time.